The valley of Elah lay stretched between the two opposing forces, an ancient stage set not just for war, but for the profound and terrifying internal struggle of a young shepherd boy. For 40 long days, the breath of two armies had been held captive by a single shadow, Goliath, the Philistine champion. Yet, the paralysis that gripped the seasoned warriors of Israel was not merely a reaction to the giant's bronze armor or his towering height. It was the collective weight of human inadequacy, the suffocating fear that whispers, "You are not enough." This fear, this crippling anxiety, was the true barrier that separated the armies. It manifested in every trembling hand, every averted gaze, every sleepless night spent anticipating certain destruction. This was the landscape of dread into which David stepped, a boy still carrying the scent of sheep and the simplicity of mountain pastures. He arrived carrying supplies for his brothers, only to encounter a scene of emotional contagion, where courage had curdled into despair. The sight of the massive, mocking Goliath was physically terrifying, but the sound of his challenges resonated deeper, striking the nerve of self-doubt that dwells in every human heart. David, watching the trained soldiers shrink from the field, felt a familiar tension tighten in his own chest. This was the same relentless pressure he faced when a lion stalked his flock, not just the physical threat, but the sudden, terrifying internal assessment. Am I capable? What if I fail the trust placed in me? The anxiety he felt was immediate, visceral, and complex. It was the specific dread of public scrutiny, the knowledge that if he dared to speak up, he would face ridicule from his own people long before he faced the giant. He risked being humiliated by his brothers, dismissed by the king, and ultimately destroyed by the enemy. The air around him was thick with silent questions. Who are you to challenge established order? You are young. You are untested. Stay in your place. The giant on the hill represented external death, but the judgmental eyes of the camp represented rejection and the crushing weight of public failure. David carried the full emotional burden of the high-stakes evaluation, the universal anxiety of the unqualified standing before an insurmountable task. The thought loop was insistent and corrosive. What if the stone misses? What if my weakness is exposed? This narrative explores that moment of profound human frailty. It is a journey into the spiritual landscape where the battle against anxiety begins. David recognized instantly that the most crucial fight was not against the Philistines' heavy spear, but against the internal giant of self-doubt that had immobilized an entire nation. He saw that the terrifying symptoms felt by the Israelites, the racing heart, the inability to act, the restless unease, were identical to the internal turmoil he himself had to master before he could even draw a smooth stone from the creek bed. We stand now at the precipice of that confrontation, not merely the physical one, but the moment David had to choose to breathe past the panic, to see beyond the immediate fear of being judged, and to commit to action rooted in a conviction greater than his circumstances. His journey is a testament to those who feel the relentless squeeze of pressure, the chilling assessment that precedes every great challenge. We follow the shepherd boy as he navigates the chasm between crippling fear and decisive courage, illustrating how the deepest internal struggles are addressed and ultimately overcome, transforming crippling anxiety into purposeful action. This is the story of identifying the giant within and choosing the path to inner freedom. The young man's conviction, though quiet, generated immediate resistance within the ranks. His eldest brother, Eliab, witnessed David's bold inquiry, the audacity of questioning the army's inertia, and his reaction was volcanic. This was the initial, personal trial David faced, not the roar of the giant, but the sharp, humiliating dismissal from his own blood. Eliab's resentment stemmed from a festering jealousy, viewing David's zeal not as faith, but as a reckless, juvenile curiosity, born of an arrogant desire for notoriety. He lashed out, questioning David's stewardship and implicitly challenging his moral character, attempting to shame him back to the fields. Such ridicule, especially from a trusted relative, often strikes deeper than external threats, serving as the first test of genuine commitment, pushing the hero toward a form of self-censorship. This moment of trial became pivotal. Instead of being silenced by the familial scorn, a potent source of public anxiety for many, David held his ground, his composure unshaken. He chose to articulate his perspective clearly, asserting the divine principle that governed the dispute, thereby elevating the confrontation above mere personal bravado. This steadfastness in the face of emotional invalidation eventually drew the attention of those reporting to the monarch, leading to the fateful summons before King Saul. Consequently, the king's immediate assessment of the shepherd boy was rooted purely in worldly metrics. Saul, himself tall and imposing, yet perpetually haunted by his own anxieties and spiritual distance, saw only an adolescent facing a heavily armed veteran. The king articulated the collective wisdom of fear, pointing out the stark imbalance in age, experience, and stature. Saul's counsel, in essence, was a demand for conformity, a request that David acknowledge his limitations and retreat. This constituted the institutional refusal of the call, an external barrier of pragmatism attempting to override David's spiritual impulse. However, recognizing David's unyielding inner certainty, Saul, in a gesture born of desperation rather than confidence, offered the only solution he knew: his own personal armor, a heavy bronze suit designed for a man twice David's girth. This offer represented a profound temptation for the young man, the chance to adopt the established structure, to fit into the conventional military mold. The king's armor was heavy, restrictive, and suffocating, a physical representation of the external expectations and crippling strategies the Israelites had been relying upon, which only served to slow them down and induce paralysis. David attempted to wear the weight of this borrowed expectation, only to find that it hampered his natural movement and restricted his breath. It was entirely alien to his prepared spiritual arsenal. This rejection of the unsuitable gear was a profound spiritual declaration. David consciously shed the weight of conventional warfare and the burdensome strategies of fear. Building on this choice, he then presented his true credentials, rooted not in military training, but in a history of divine protection garnered during his solitary vigil over the flocks. He recounted the harrowing, private moments when he faced the lion and the bear, battles fought not in front of an audience, but in the wilderness, where his only recourse was radical reliance on the Lord's intervention. Those were the crucible moments that forged his faith, demonstrating that his strength resided outside his own physical frame, residing instead in the conviction that the divine shepherd protected his own. This history of isolated victory was the true meeting with the mentor, confirming that his preparation was internal and spiritual, not external and material, paving the way for the critical transition into the unfamiliar territory of the battlefield. The transition from the sheltered, anxious perimeter of the Israelite encampment to the open, intimidating expanse of the valley of Elah marked David's true crossing the threshold. He stepped deliberately beyond the line of terrified soldiers, leaving behind the suffocating paralysis of the fearful, trading the noise of communal despair for the profound silence of singular commitment. The air immediately grew colder, sharper, imbued with the raw reality of the waiting threat. It was a passage from the realm of complex political and military failure into a space governed solely by divine instruction. Consequently, the physical environment of the battlefield itself became an arena for practical theology. David sought the shallow, winding brook that ran through the valley floor. This moment was less about scavenging for simple ammunition and more about a calculated, ritualistic preparation. He did not hastily grab rough stones. Rather, he carefully selected 5 smooth river stones. Their smoothness was paramount, signifying the removal of the sharp, jagged edges of doubt, impatience, and self-reliance. They represented polished readiness, tools refined by the continuous action of nature, mirroring the way faith is smoothed and strengthened through persistent, ordinary challenges. These stones, resting coolly in his pouch, were the tangible substance of the trial, chosen not for their bulk, but for their aerodynamic perfection, maximizing the velocity derived from focused, practiced skill. Moreover, this act signaled an inherent understanding of asymmetric warfare, rooted in faith. While Goliath relied upon the sheer volume of his bronze shield and spear, David anchored his strategy in speed, precision, and the ultimate recognition that the fight was fundamentally spiritual. The Philistine champion strode forth, a massive, mobile fortress, his very presence an act of sustained psychological intimidation. David, conversely, moved with the lightness of one unburdened by fear of personal defeat, carrying only his shepherd's staff and a sling, an instrument of defense honed through years of solitary diligence, now transformed into a potent vehicle of divine justice. As David approached the midpoint of the valley, the psychological intensity surrounding Goliath reached its peak. The giant, observing the lone, diminutive figure advancing, erupted in scorn. This was the moment where the conflict intensified beyond physical threat into open spiritual warfare. Goliath's derisive questioning of David's honor and his contemptuous cursing, delivered in the names of his own deities, revealed the hidden truth of the confrontation. This was not merely a skirmish for territory or pride. It was a cosmic battle for the recognition of sovereignty. David absorbed this blasphemy, recognizing that the outrage expressed against the divine name was the ultimate impetus for his action. This theological clarity became the engine of his courage. He gained a revelation. The immensity of the enemy no longer mattered because the power backing him was infinitely greater. The fear that had once threatened to constrict his breath transformed into a focused, singular resolve, channeling all his internal energy toward the immediate task. The panic evaporated, replaced by the profound, cold certainty of purpose. He was a vessel, prepared and placed precisely in that desperate moment, guided by the immutable hand of providence. The battle was no longer his to win or lose. It was simply his to execute. This divine intervention provided not a miracle of immediate safety, but a miracle of perfect inner alignment and resolute conviction, allowing him to fix his eyes, not on the giant's overwhelming appearance, but on the vulnerability dictated by celestial strategy. Goliath's challenge transcended mere vocal volume. It was a sophisticated tactic designed to leverage the natural human tendency towards self-preservation. The giant, moving with deliberate, rhythmic steps, created a sensory cacophony. The grinding weight of his scale armor, the rhythmic thud of his brazen steps, all intended to saturate David's perception with inescapable threat. This physical display served as the primary test, seeking to trigger the debilitating freeze response by overwhelming the boy's cognitive ability to process the threat efficiently. The very air vibrated with this aggression, demanding an immediate, decisive counter-strategy not of brute force, but of mental fortification. David's response, conversely, was characterized by an almost unnerving stillness beneath the surface turbulence. He understood that the only way to manage the crushing pressure was to narrow his focus relentlessly. His inner state was not one of reckless fervor, but of pinpoint calculation. He ignored the colossal figure's taunts and the spectacle of the shaking spear, concentrating instead on essential, practical variables. The subtle crossbreeze, the uneven terrain that could trip his approach, and the precise moment when the distance between them would achieve optimal velocity for his projectile. This required the immediate, full application of cognitive resources, transforming high-stakes anxiety into high-functioning execution. Now, consider how this applies when you face a challenge where sensory overload threatens your composure. The victory lies in prioritizing the single, actionable step over the totality of the looming threat. Crucially, the skill David relied upon was not an endowment of divine magic, but the consequence of relentless, mundane practice. The precision required to strike a tiny, moving target, a stray lamb or a scavenging jackal, was now seamlessly transferred to the battlefield. Every hour spent perfecting the sling's trajectory in the lonely hills, every frustrating missed shot corrected and relearned, coalesced into an undeniable ally in that moment. This silent preparation became his most formidable asset, proving that fidelity to routine and mastery of small disciplines are the bedrock upon which courage is built during monumental confrontations. His confidence was not abstract hope, it was quantified by accumulated physical memory. Furthermore, his running approach, a move completely counterintuitive to avoiding a massive armed figure, was the ultimate psychological declaration. While fear typically dictates retreat or rigid standing, David's forward momentum shattered Goliath's expectation of passive terror. This sprint symbolized a complete and total commitment, forcing the giant to recalibrate, and disrupting his intended rhythm of mockery. By actively engaging the physical danger, David overcame the deep, internal moral dilemma of self-preservation versus divine commission. He chose action over analysis, demonstrating that sometimes the only way to neutralize paralyzing dread is to move directly toward its source with unstoppable resolve. The moment of the throw demanded perfect kinetic timing. David drew on the centrifugal force generated by his movement, the smooth stones transforming into a focused extension of his unwavering will. The sound of the sling cutting through the air was sharp and singular, a piercing counterpoint to the deep, heavy rumble of Goliath's challenge. It was an irreversible act, a physical manifestation of his surrender to divine strategy. He didn't just hope the stone would strike. He executed the technique honed over years, trusting that the placement, velocity, and power of the strike were now fully consecrated and guided. The missile flew, not as a random object, but as the inevitable consequence of a tested faith meeting a strategic necessity, aimed directly at the precise point of vulnerability, the unguarded forehead, unprotected by the heavy bronze helm. This singular focus eliminated all residual space for doubt, transforming the terror of high stakes into the cold certainty of purposeful impact. The projectile, moving with focused, unseen speed, met its mark with an audible, skull-crushing impact. The sheer kinetic energy, concentrated into a single, small point, instantly disrupted the giant's colossal balance, stripping him of consciousness before his body even began its descent. The fall of Goliath was not a gradual toppling. It was a devastating, earth-shaking implosion. His massive frame, encased entirely in bronze and iron, struck the rocky earth like a felled tower, releasing a profound cloud of dust and a deep, echoing tremor that resonated through the valley walls, momentarily displacing the heavy air. At that seismic moment, the battlefield experienced an instantaneous and total cessation of human noise. The aggressive shouts of the Philistines, the panicked breathing of the Israelites, and even the subtle grinding of armor were all swallowed by a profound vacuum of disbelief. This silence was the first undeniable testament to the magnitude of the completed spiritual ordeal, a frozen moment where the known laws of military engagement were suspended. The overwhelming threat, which had imposed 40 days of debilitating fear, had vanished in the space of a heartbeat, proving that the most intimidating obstacles often possess the most critical points of vulnerability. Consequently, for David, witnessing the inert bulk of the antagonist sprawled before him signified more than military success. It was the definitive silencing of the relentless internal anxieties. The corrosive voice that had whispered inadequacy and failure was eradicated by the visible, irrefutable truth laid bare on the earth. This sudden clarity was the ultimate reward, the acquisition of profound spiritual authority, replacing self-doubt with the conviction of a clear mandate. He moved toward the fallen giant, driven not by vengeance, but by the necessity of finality, ensuring the total cessation of the immediate threat that still paralyzed the two armies. The task, he knew instinctively, was not fully complete until the spiritual battle was unequivocally cemented in the material realm. Crucially, David had to appropriate the very instrument of the enemy's pride. He quickly drew the giant's own immense, heavy sword from its sheath, a weapon previously used for intimidation, now transformed into the tool of divine execution. This physical act of separating the champion's head from his body was a powerful symbolic gesture. The defeat of the external giant was irrevocably linked to the death of the internal giant of fear that had afflicted the nation. By standing over the behemoth and holding high the massive sword, David confirmed his transition from a shepherd boy burdened by anxiety to a proven, authorized agent of divine power. Observe how this immediate follow-through amplified the divine message. Had David merely struck the giant and retreated, the victory might have been attributed to sheer luck or a random accident. Yet, this decisive, subsequent action forced both armies to accept the reality that a transcendent power had decisively intervened. The visible outcome served as a theological lesson delivered without discourse, that reliance on overwhelming resources and physical stature, the giant's armor, is utterly meaningless against the focused, purposeful alignment with divine will. Building on this, the fear instantly transferred to the Philistines. Their entire strategy had depended upon the myth of Goliath's invincibility. The shattering of that myth induced immediate, contagious terror. The sight of their champion defeated by an unarmed youth caused an immediate rout, transforming the previous paralysis of the Israelites into a galvanized, righteous pursuit. Now, consider this sudden, radical reversal in your own life. When an anxiety you've battled relentlessly collapses under the weight of focused action, the authority you gain is not just personal. It changes the entire dynamic of the world around you, turning adversaries into witnesses and crippling fear into unstoppable momentum. The victory was secured by the stone, but the revelation was cemented by the sword. The sudden, overwhelming defeat of the Philistine champion triggered a massive, immediate psychological shift in the Israeli ranks. Where fear had previously clamped down, manifesting as physical stiffness and mental fog, a torrent of exhilaration now flooded the soldiers' consciousness. They shed the inertia of 40 days instantly, transforming their collective paralysis into furious, unified action. The spectacle of their champion, the symbol of their deepest, most debilitating anxiety, lying prone, catalyzed an unstoppable forward surge. This rush, driven by relief and restored faith, carried them across the valley floor and into a relentless pursuit of the now terrified and scattering Philistine forces. David, however, did not join the immediate, chaotic pursuit. He paused, absorbing the profound, silent transformation that had occurred within him. The overwhelming sense of public scrutiny, the fear of being judged, the apprehension of failing the expectations of his family and king, had dissolved, replaced by a deep, unwavering spiritual peace. The weight of the world had lifted, proving that his faithfulness to preparation and his trust in God were not abstract concepts, but tangible, powerful realities. He returned to the Israelite camp carrying the ultimate token, the giant's head and his colossal sword. These items were not mere spoils of war. They were visual, undeniable artifacts of a battle fought and won first in the spirit, then in the physical realm. Consequently, the aftermath was characterized by an immediate, irreversible realignment of the power structure. King Saul, who had viewed David with patronizing skepticism, was now forced to confront the young man's undeniable spiritual authority. David's presence instantly challenged the existing order, highlighting the king's profound moral and spiritual failures, his inability to lead through faith and his reliance on worldly stature. David's triumph was a silent, powerful sermon preached to the entire nation, emphasizing that the criteria for true leadership transcended physical appearance or institutional endorsement. It lay squarely in radical obedience. Furthermore, the initial rejection and scorn David endured from his brother Eliab now crumbled into embarrassed silence. The familial subplot of resentment and misplaced pride was resolved not through confrontation, but through the overwhelming evidence of divine selection. Eliab and the others could no longer dismiss David as merely an arrogant youth. His actions had publicly validated his quiet claims of spiritual purpose. This quiet resolution within the family unit underscored a vital truth, that the most potent response to personal critique and skepticism is not argument, but demonstrable, faithful action. The ultimate lesson of this aftermath lay in the integration of the internal and external victories. David had not merely survived the external threat. He had successfully metabolized his personal anxiety and transformed that volatile energy into purposeful courage. He returned to the camp a fundamentally changed person, possessing a solidified identity, no longer just the shepherd boy, but the divinely sanctioned deliverer. This transformation cemented his place within the divine narrative, marking the end of his ordinary world and the commencement of a destiny now irreversibly intertwined with the fate of Israel. This period of consolidation served as the vital road back. David now carried the heavy burden of consequence, the visibility, the adoration, and the political implications that came with being an anointed victor. His subsequent actions would no longer be personal. They would be scrutinized as prophetic and national. He had learned that overcoming the giant of anxiety grants one authority, but maintaining that authority requires a continuous, humble reliance on the source of that power. ensuring that the personal victory over fear serves a greater, enduring purpose. His quiet return, amidst the triumphant chaos, was the first step on a long road where the battles, though different, would still require the same radical reliance and clarity of purpose. David's return journey to the main camp was less a walk and more a procession. Yet the internal landscape remained anchored in sober reflection, distinct from the boisterous elation surrounding him. He carried the trophies of war, Goliath's colossal, silent head and the giant's immense sword, not as objects of pride, but as stark, enduring monuments to God's fidelity. This pilgrimage back was the psychological road back, where the hero processes the extreme nature of the ordeal and begins the complex task of reintegrating the extraordinary experience into daily life. The external adulation was immediate and overwhelming, a cacophony of praise that contrasted sharply with the profound solitude he had inhabited moments earlier in the valley. The initial challenge of this road lay in managing the sudden, blinding flash of fame. David had stepped onto the field anonymously, yet he returned instantaneously branded as the nation's spiritual hero. This rapid transition introduced a new, nuanced form of anxiety, the pressure of constant visibility and the heightened stakes of all future actions. He recognized that while the physical giant was slain, the political and emotional giants of expectation and envy were only beginning to stir. His triumph had placed him squarely in the perilous gaze of power, specifically the unstable attention of King Saul, whose internal struggles with paranoia and insecurity were instantly magnified by David's achievement. Consequently, the young man had to exercise a wisdom far beyond his years, moving through the celebrations with humility, acknowledging the source of his strength without claiming personal glory. This careful, deliberate attribution of victory to the Lord became his spiritual shield against the corrupting influence of sudden fame. He modeled a crucial principle. True deliverance from anxiety involves not just overcoming the fear of failure, but also the mastery over the pride of success. His actions consistently redirected the focus away from his youth and skill, anchoring the narrative firmly in divine providence, thereby establishing the necessary spiritual boundary required to sustain his mental equilibrium. Moreover, the victory served as a catalyst for a national spiritual resurrection. David's act resonated far beyond the battle itself, initiating a massive spiritual revival among the demoralized Israelites. They saw in the shepherd boy's victory a tangible proof of their covenant relationship with God. Their fear did not just recede. It was replaced by a renewed, active sense of corporate identity and purpose. This restored hope, symbolized by the triumphant cries echoing across the hills, became the elixir David brought back to his people, a spiritual medicine curing the malaise of national despair. He brought not just victory, but a foundational lesson about the nature of courage, that it is not the absence of fear, but the conviction that God's purpose transcends personal vulnerability. This realization offered a blueprint for others facing internal giants of worry, stress, and self-doubt. The smooth stones, once nestled in the brook, now represented the truth that everyday resources, when consecrated and applied with unwavering faith, possess the kinetic power to dismantle the world's most terrifying structures. His journey, therefore, culminated not merely in the return to his home, but in the establishment of a profound legacy. David did not return to the sheepfolds unchanged. He returned as a vessel of transformative truth. He had demonstrated that the path to overcoming crippling anxiety is paved with preparation, guided by faith, and secured through purposeful action that refuses to capitulate to the overwhelming presence of doubt. His life became a living testimony, confirming that the very pressures that seek to crush us can, through divine strength, be transformed into the very leverage needed to achieve monumental victory. This was the ultimate gift, the enduring revelation that vulnerability, when anchored in conviction, becomes the birthplace of true, lasting strength. The ultimate spiritual legacy of David's triumph resonated not in the fall of the giant, but in the enduring principle that he demonstrated, the total mastery of internal landscape over external circumstance. The narrative of the shepherd boy became a timeless blueprint for confronting the anxiety that seeks to paralyze action. David's victory ensured that future generations would understand that the true measure of a crisis is not its physical size, but the quality of the faith mobilized against it. This lesson transcends history, speaking directly to those today who feel the insidious grip of generalized apprehension, the constant, debilitating weight of expectation, or the fear of inevitable failure. David's story serves as the return with the elixir, a message distilled from the intense pressure of the battlefield. The elixir itself is the unwavering truth that the battles we face are fundamentally unwinnable in our own strength, yet entirely manageable when we connect our limited resources to unlimited power. He showed that the secret to combating anxiety lies in recognizing that the enemy is often exaggerated by our own internal assessment, while our divine backing is perpetually underestimated. The very act of preparing the 5 smooth stones, the mundane actions of faith, prayer, seeking support, and focused effort, are the actionable stones necessary to address modern mental challenges. This enduring narrative challenges the pervasive contemporary notion that we must achieve perfection before daring to act. David was imperfect, youthful, and lacking the prerequisite credentials, yet he chose bold, faithful action. He dismantled the myth of qualification, asserting that divine selection and obedience are the only necessary requirements for confronting perceived impossibilities. Therefore, the message today for those experiencing the racing heart and sleepless nights is clear. Stop measuring the height of the giant and start polishing your stones of faithful discipline. The final impression left by David is one of radical trust overriding paralyzing doubt. He demonstrated that anxiety, though a fierce internal giant, can be confronted when its physical manifestation is ignored and the focus is fixed entirely on the immutable promise of providence. The power of his example encourages the reader to identify their own debilitating giants, be they financial fears, career uncertainty, or social pressure, and to cease viewing them as insurmountable obstacles. Instead, they are presented as opportunities for the demonstration of a deeply rooted, intentional faith. Ultimately, the Valley of Elah stands as a monumental reminder that even the deepest internal struggles are not fought in isolation. David's faith provided the template for moving from chronic apprehension to triumphant purpose, assuring us that the anxieties of the modern world can be mastered. This legacy is a profound call to move beyond passive worry and engage in the active, strategic use of spiritual tools, transforming fear into a focused energy that aligns human will with divine intention, thereby achieving lasting, transformative victory. The true measure of the victory achieved in the Valley of Elah was not realized in the immediate shock of the giant's fall, nor in the swift rout of the Philistines. Its deepest impact unfolded over time, establishing an irreversible covenant precedent that redefined the spiritual demographic of Israel. David's action, far from being a singular military anomaly, was a divine intervention designed to prove the accessibility of God's power to anyone, regardless of social pedigree or military rank. This legacy fundamentally shifted the national consciousness, transforming the divine protector from a figure of abstract, historical memory into an immediate, active presence ready to champion the cause of the faithful underdog. Furthermore, the elixir David carried back was the profound ethical lesson embedded within his method. The enduring narrative emphasizes the value of authenticity in confrontation. David refused to adopt the heavy, alienating structure of Saul's armor. He chose instead to rely on the genuine skills and simple implements honed during his solitary, faithful stewardship. This is the antidote to the anxiety born of imposter syndrome, the paralyzing fear that one must pretend to be someone else or assume a restrictive role to meet monumental expectations. He taught that one's unique, prepared self is the most powerful weapon, consecrated by intentional fidelity to ordinary duties. Now, consider how this applies when you face a challenging new professional environment where you feel compelled to wear the heavy, ill-fitting armor of established, complex jargon or rigid, outdated protocol to gain acceptance. Another crucial layer of the legacy is the establishment of retrospective strength. The memory of Goliath's collapse became the nation's foundational touchstone, a permanent, undeniable reference point against which all subsequent fears could be measured and diminished. Whenever a future threat loomed or internal anxiety started to creep back into the national psyche, the people could simply point to the giant's sword, now revered as a national artifact, and recall the undeniable power of their faith in action. This perpetual validation served as a critical psychological tool, providing concrete evidence that the spiritual resources are always greater than the material threat, ensuring that the victory was sustained long after the dust settled. Building on this, the success catalyzed a crucial institutional reset, shattering the long-standing national paralysis driven by generational fear. The leadership had become stagnant, defined by its reliance on overwhelming size and predictable maneuvers, a classic demonstration of institutional inertia. David's victory granted explicit permission to abandon these predictable, fear-driven methodologies. It injected a dynamic, innovative spirit, demonstrating that inspired, faith-fueled action, even if it appears unorthodox or under-resourced, will invariably outperform the strategies dictated by entrenched, worldly pragmatism. The Shepherd Boys' approach was a masterclass in leveraging mobility and precision over static defense, offering a potent model for systemic change. Consequently, the ultimate psychological gift David bestowed was the knowledge that inner calm must precede outer triumph. He proved that the battle against anxiety is won the moment we replace the internal monologue of fear with a declarative, focused affirmation of divine partnership. This release, the freedom from the burden of self-reliance, is the most transferable lesson. The victory revealed that the true cost of anxiety is not the worry itself, but the lost opportunity for effective action. The enduring power of his story lies in its simplicity, a reminder that the path to transcending our greatest fears is found in choosing focus over panic, execution over hesitation, and divine authority over perceived inadequacy. David returned with the knowledge that the smallest, most prepared heart, when aligned with the infinite, possesses the velocity necessary to fell the most intimidating giants of worry and doubt. The shift that occurred within the contested space was one of profound psychological architecture. It was the moment when paralyzing dread, a corrosive force that had settled deep into the bones of 1,000 veteran warriors, ceded its ground to the electrifying clarity of conviction. The air, once heavy with the odor of anticipation and despair, suddenly felt crisp, carrying the sharp, undeniable truth that overwhelming size is merely an illusion when measured against the kinetic force of purposeful faith. The actual barrier to progress was never the colossal figure advancing across the field, but the pervasive internal voice of inadequacy that had been accepted as fact by an entire army. The victory, therefore, was a matter of internal translation. The protagonist achieved success not through sudden magic or superior physical might, but by converting years of solitary, faithful diligence into focused execution. Every hour spent perfecting a difficult, mundane skill in the quiet wilderness became the currency used to purchase freedom on the public stage. The humble tools he employed were simply the physical manifestation of his prepared spirit, demonstrating that the resources we truly need are often those refined by continuous, small acts of fidelity, already resting within the reservoir of our history. These honed instruments, seemingly insignificant, possess the perfect geometry to harness the necessary velocity, proving that true power resides in precision and alignment, not mass or volume. Reflecting on this journey so far, we grasp that the core victory was psychological and spiritual. Before the missile found its target, the hero had already rejected the debilitating weight of borrowed expectation. He wisely understood that wearing the heavy, ill-fitting strategies of fear, the institutional bronze shell designed for larger, slower combatants, would only guarantee his defeat by sacrificing his essential agility. The rejection of that unsuitable structure was a declaration of authenticity, a foundational move that allowed the volatile energy of high-stakes pressure to be channeled directly into decisive action, rather than being allowed to fracture into internal chaos. The moment the confrontation peaked, the hero's mind achieved an unnerving synthesis. The racing heart and tightened musculature, the very symptoms of panic, were not fought but utilized. The adrenaline surge, often a prelude to the freeze response, was instead leveraged into hyperfocus. He reduced the world, momentarily, to a singular, actionable point, the only path to escaping the cognitive saturation of the enemy's intimidating display. This focused gaze, rejecting the full, terrifying panorama for a single, critical vulnerability, became the ultimate de-escalation of the threat. The cumulative effect of this focused resolve was instantaneous. A seemingly immovable object was instantly rendered inert by the convergence of practice, skill, and spiritual certainty. The resulting shock wave permeated the entire social structure, replacing paralyzing inertia with unstoppable corporate momentum. The triumph acted as a profound, national spiritual reset, curing the malaise of learned helplessness that had plagued the populace. The subsequent reality was irrevocably altered. The hero, though still possessing the same youthful physique, now moved under a mantle of confirmed authority. The challenge shifted from overcoming the initial obstacle to sustaining the difficult, yet essential, equilibrium of life under the scrutiny of consequence. The valley provided the proving ground, but the vast, uncharted territory of the future requires the continuous, humble commitment to the source of that kinetic energy, ensuring that the hard-won freedom from fear is never squandered on the shifting sands of public opinion or self-doubt. The Valley of Elah, having witnessed the spectacular collapse of human terror, settled back into an echoing quiet. The cheers and the sounds of pursuit faded, leaving behind a profound stillness where the true, irreversible change had occurred. It was in this silence that the full measure of David's victory became clear. The external battle against the bronze-clad champion was merely the physical manifestation of a far deeper conquest waged within the heart. The anxiety that had immobilized an army, the chilling dread of inadequacy, the fear of judgment, and the suffocating weight of inevitable failure had been decisively routed, not by brute strength, but by a focused, prepared, and unwavering spiritual conviction. The enduring lesson was forged in the act of rejecting Saul's armor. That heavy shell represented the world's strategy for managing fear, reliance on inherited systems, conventional size, and manufactured security. David understood, perhaps intuitively, that the solutions prescribed by fear only amplify the internal constriction. He chose instead the lightness of his own history, the refined, ready-made truth found in his shepherd's pouch. The 5 smooth stones, now symbolic, testify eternally to the power of deliberate preparation and consecrated effort. They represent the transferable principle that the resources needed for monumental confrontation are often found not in complexity, but in the faithful mastery of simple, everyday disciplines, ready to be launched by focused intent. This legacy speaks directly to the invisible giants that dominate the modern landscape. The tyranny of relentless pressure, the gnawing anxiety of assessment, and the systemic fear of economic and social failure. These are Goliaths of the mind, immense and loud, capable of paralyzing entire lives with the incessant whisper of what if. David's methodology provides a profound blueprint for leveraging the volatility of high-stakes pressure, converting internal chaos into focused, unwavering purpose. He demonstrated that courage is not the absence of the racing heart, but the deliberate, conscious choice to fix one's gaze, not on the giant's overwhelming scale, but on the precise, actionable target that faith reveals. The true gift David carried back was the spiritual antidote to despair, the undeniable knowledge that one's deepest vulnerabilities, when anchored in an allegiance higher than self-preservation, become the very leverage points for breakthrough. He brought back the assurance that the most effective way to quiet the inner turmoil of doubt is through the kinetic engagement of purpose. The moment the stone was launched, every vestige of self-doubt was irrevocably committed to the trajectory of divine will. As we face our own intimidating challenges, the looming deadlines, the relentless demands on our capacity, the private battles that steal our sleep, we are invited back to the Valley of Elah. We are called to stop measuring the colossal size of the threat and to begin examining the readiness of our own chosen resources. The victory is achieved when we shed the heavy, ill-fitting armor of the world's expectations and reclaim the power of our authentic, faith-honed skills. Let the internal earthquake of anxiety settle into an enduring bedrock of spiritual equilibrium. The smooth stones are still available, waiting for the heart that dares to act. The final, transforming insight remains. The ultimate victory is not merely defeating the external giant, but achieving the profound inner clarity that allows one to run toward the challenge, armed only with conviction.